Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be digging deep and talking about a once-in-a-decade opportunity, the national census. The question is, does it really matter? Or is it just another way for the government to track our information? Let's find out. Let's look at some research that might inform our perspective. Let's start with the basics. What is the census? The census is a decennial attempt to count every single American. When was it created? The U.S. Census is mandated by the Constitution and was originally established to decide how many representatives each state would get. The first ever census was administered in the summer of 1790. For context, at the time of this census, enslaved Africans were being counted as 3/5 of a person. Same for the indigenous people. This is interesting to know when we reflect on the fact that to this day, communities of color are grossly undercounted, but we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Now, why does any of this even matter? Federal programs are based on population, and so federal government is going to be handing out billions of dollars to localities based on how many people live there. They figure out how many people live there based on the census. If your area is undercounted, you will receive a smaller portion of this federal money than you deserve.
So when you think about what that looks like in terms of college preparation programs, in terms of hospitals and healthcare, senior citizen centers, if your community is only showing up on the census at 40%, you're literally getting 40 cents on the dollar. What's doubly worse about that is those formulas last for a 10-year period. So if in 2010 you did not fill out the census and your community did not fill out the census, we're literally still dealing with the lack of funding based on the 20 cents.
And then it's compounded because those things impact you behaviorally, with your health,
Absolutely.
Your mental health, all of these things.
Absolutely.
And so you could be a 5-year-old that's now 15. You can be a 10-year-old that's now 20 and trying to figure your life out. And it's all because your schools didn't have the proper funding.
They were underfunded, understaffed, whatever it may be.
From kindergarten, elementary, middle school, and high school.
So in theory, is what you're saying based more on community and location, but it affects people of color the most?
Well, because we live in hyper-segregated communities.
Right.
So yes to both of those things. And so if you live in a community like Bedford-Stuyvesant or Brownsville or Harlem, you are literally living around people who very much look like you, who share the same fears that you do about government and about participating in something like the census. And as a result, traditionally, year over year over year, we end up being underfunded. So for example, if you're living in my community, you might walk 4 or 5 blocks before you can find a trash can, right? Before you could, so you literally, if you're trying to keep your community clean, you got to hold on to whatever trash you have in your hand for 4 or 5 blocks before you can find a place to properly dispose of it. Whereas if I go to Park Slope, which is a very white community, and white communities tend to have over-representation on the census, and we can talk about why in a moment, you might find a trash can on every single corner of every single intersection. Mm-hmm. So literally the physical infrastructure for maintaining the cleanliness of your community is underfunded in such a way that it compounds the lack of resources that we already have.
So why don't some Americans trust the process? Historically, information has been extracted from communities of color and used against them. This is not just a conspiracy sold to immigrants. Random strangers coming into villages to ask questions eventually led to centuries of enslavement for Africans in the Americas. Even after enslavement ended, officers from social services could facilitate surprise visits to your home, where who and what they observed could affect what kind of social services you received. The fear these traumas caused runs deep.
Bringing things into your home which you may not be deducting. Now, you know I have to deduct you on those things.
What things? What things, damn it? You have a man come over for dinner, he brings you a bottle of wine. I have a man come over for dinner, he brings me a damn 6-pack.
Currently, we are living through a xenophobic administration that has targeted certain immigrants as an enemy by signing executive orders to enhance enforcement along the U.S.-Mexico border through the construction of a wall, expanding the use of detention centers, and limiting access to asylum. This same administration attempted to add a question about citizenship to the 2020 census, claiming that this was not out of the ordinary, as this question has been included on every census with the exception of 2010.
We're spending $15 to $20 billion on a census, and you're not allowed to ask them, are you a citizen?
A fact check reveals that this was not the case. Unfortunately, the average American does not fact check. After the Supreme Court blocked administrative efforts to add a citizen question because it would lead to less responses, the Trump administration eventually stopped pushing back. Mistrust of government is ever present in today's society. So, the Census Bureau conducted a survey in 2018 to better understand what attitudes the average American may hold about the census. They found out that roughly 1/4 of respondents were worried that their responses to the census would be used against them. Those most concerned included non-Hispanic Asians, households not proficient in English, and those born outside of the U.S. The Census Bureau used all the information they received to be intentional with their marketing for the ongoing census.
Now more than ever, it's super important that every New Yorker counts. The COVID-19 pandemic is affecting us all, but it's affecting our Black and brown communities the most. And the only way to get the programs and the funding that we deserve is to fill out the census. It only comes once every 10 years, it's only 10 simple questions, and by law, your information cannot be shared. There are no citizenship questions on the census, so go to my2020census.gov and get counted.
A lot of people are uncomfortable with race and ethnicity being separated on the census. It feels like an attempt to divide and conquer communities of color. I don't disagree, but this is not the time for an identity crisis. The national census is not the time to have this conversation around identity. There's too much at stake. The data doesn't lie. The results of this survey will either help or disadvantage certain communities for the next 10 years. In 2010, the self-response rate in New York was 62%, while the national average was 76%. In some neighborhoods, the response rates were as low as 35%. Now that we better understand the connection between the undercounted and underfunded, we need to do our part to both respond and raise awareness about the importance of the census. If you found this information helpful, down below you'll find links to resources that you can read or watch so you can keep learning. Please remember to hit like, drop a comment, and share this with a friend who is expressing disinterest or distrust in filling out the 2020 census. The time is now. Let's do our part.